Hi, this is Doug Brown. I'll be presenting episode 9 in the Mountainside Apologetics series, in which we'll look at how archaeology supports the Bible's accuracy and historicity. So there's lots of information there. Fasten your seatbelts and join me as we take this journey. As you can see from my credentials, I'm not an archaeologist. I have a background in computer science and in engineering. I have a long history of studying the Bible. I'm an elder in my church, and so I have a tremendous appreciation for the Bible and for all of the myriad evidences of biblical accuracy in archaeology. There are literally hundreds, probably thousands of archaeological finds supporting the Bible, and thanks to the internet, I have access to those and will be presenting them to you. As you can see, we're going to be covering a lot. I'm going to organize this talk chronologically. I'll start with evidence from around the time of Abraham and to go through the Exodus, the time of the Judges, the time of the Kings in the Old Testament, the time of the Babylonian captivity, and I'll look at some evidence from the time of Jesus and evidence from the time of Acts and the travels of the Apostle Paul. So we'll cover a lot of territory. We won't cover nearly all of the archaeological evidence that does support the Bible, but we'll do our best to hit some of the most important finds. Well, there's the question, can archaeology prove the Bible? I would say no, it can't prove the Bible is true. And there are always ongoing discoveries just to make things more interesting. But it could prove the Bible to be incorrect if there were clear evidence uncovered that contradicts a statement in Scripture. There have been several attempts to claim that. It's never happened. In fact, often the skeptics have made claims that the Bible was in error only in a matter of years or decades to have the skeptics proven wrong by some subsequent discoveries. For example, the skeptics said the Hittites didn't exist. This is going back 150, 200 years ago. There are no such people as the Hittites until the archaeologists discovered in the 1800s, I believe it was, evidence of an extensive Hittite empire in Asia Minor. So there have been thousands of archaeological discoveries that corroborate the Bible, mentioning the places and the people mentioned in the Bible. Some of the events that occurred in the Bible are corroborated by archaeology and through history. So we'll be looking at those. Now, just one clarification. I'm looking primarily at archaeology, that is, things people have dug up and uncovered. History can include documents. The Bible itself is history, and it has been proven true through other discoveries. But we'll be looking at the things, the places that they've dug up, inscriptions that have been found that reference biblical names and places. So, chronology is a major issue in evaluating archaeology. And I've discovered that as I've looked at and listened to a number of presentations on this. I've discovered that those who believe the Bible to be God's inspired word, as I do, and the secular skeptics tend to assume different chronologies in many cases. The Bible does give some specific information regarding times and dates, but these are generally relative to certain events. In fact, the next bullet there, archaeologists don't find date stamps in their digs. Now, wouldn't it be nice if they dug up a city and the stone over the entrance to the city said established in 1450 BC? Well, they didn't have any concept of BC. So what they do in the Bible and in most other documents, they'll say things like, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, so-and-so happened. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. In 1 Kings 6:1, it talks about the building of the temple in Jerusalem, and it says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. So the Bible does give some relative dates, how many years between this event and that event, and it talks about dates in terms of reigns and significant events. But we have to do some detective work to try to figure out the dates that things happened. They aren't just clearly specified in Scripture or in archaeology. So we'll see where traditional Egyptian chronology has been brought into question by some of the archaeologists, although the mainstream archaeologists tend to stick with the currently accepted conventional wisdom. But we could revise the chronology of Egypt in a way that makes it much more compatible with the Bible, and there's been a lot of evidence presented to support that fact. So chronology is something we'll talk about a little bit in our discussions. There is a problem we get, too, in that everyone has biases. I remember watching a DVD on the Exodus, and one archaeologist who believes the biblical account was asked, well, don't you have your biases? And his answer was, yes, we all have biases, but we can't make up the data. And he proceeded to talk about all the data, all the information that's been uncovered, all the archaeological finds, and how they corroborate what's in the Bible. So one of the chronological problems we run into is that mainstream archaeologists tend to say that the Exodus must have occurred in the 1200s BC, around 1250. And they claim that Ramesses was the pharaoh of the Exodus. However, this is all based upon one Bible verse that refers in the book of Exodus to the store city of Pi-Ramses. Now, the fact that the city has a name of Ramses doesn't mean that was the pharaoh. And they proceed then to declare that Ramses must have been the pharaoh of the Exodus, and there's no evidence that an Exodus took place in the time of Ramses. Therefore, there was no Exodus. But if you look 200 years before Ramses, you find ample evidence of an Exodus. So that's where chronology gets in the way of interpretation. The same thing happens, by the way, with regard to the destruction of Jericho. One of the prime archaeologists who dig in Jericho found lots of evidence of destruction, but she simply dated that evidence to 200 years earlier than the conventional belief in the time of the Exodus. So biases do get in the way, and we have to be careful about that on our part as well as on the part of the skeptics. So we'll proceed to the first dig. It's occurring right now, that addresses the earliest times in the biblical record. Abraham and Lot lived in the time of the city of Sodom. If you remember, the angels went to Abraham informing him that God was about to destroy the city, and they went into the city and warned Lot and got him to leave. So it was, according to the Bible, Abraham's time. The site of the city of Sodom is currently being excavated by a team from Trinity Southwest University, located right here in Albuquerque. This team is being led by Dr. Stephen Collins. Dr. Collins and Dr. Latane Scott, a member of our church, co-wrote a book called Discovering the City of Sodom, and I strongly recommend it for anyone who's interested in this topic. He's digging in Tal el Hammam, in the Jordan Valley, a few miles northeast of the Dead Sea. Now, this spot, he believes, is the site of Sodom, and there's been a lot of digging and a lot of things uncovered since the book was written. But he believed that was the right spot because this area is visible from the Judean hills where Abraham and Lot parted ways. They could have seen this area north of the Dead Sea. They couldn't have seen Sodom if Sodom had been on the southern end of the Dead Sea, which some people have claimed. And it was a thriving city in the time of Abraham. We get down to chronologies. We think Abraham started his journey somewhere around 2000 BC. So by the destruction of Sodom would have been 1850 to 1900 BC, somewhere in there. Well, the Tal el Hammam dig has produced some really phenomenal results, in my opinion. Some of these results they actually obtained very early in the dig just by sheer, I won't say luck, but coincidence. Turns out the Jordanian army had dug a trench through this mound during one of the wars with Israel. And because of that, they were able to go into the trench and find things that were pretty deep in the mound and look at them very early on. They found some clay pottery that had been fused into glass on the surface by intense heat. Now, Dr. Collins took the piece of pottery to a professor at New Mexico Tech and had asked her what she thought of it. She looked at it and she says, "This looks like trinitite." Trinitite is the dirt, the earth that was fused by the nuclear bomb, the very first nuclear explosion set off at the Trinity site out in the New Mexico desert, not far from Socorro. Well, we don't believe a nuclear bomb destroyed the city of Sodom, but the current theory that some of Dr. Collins' team has is that there was a low-altitude meteoric airburst, that a meteor came in low over the Dead Sea, that it generated such intense heat, which we know happens in a meteoric burst like that, that it actually exploded the cities, that it threw brine into the air, lots of salt from the Dead Sea, and contaminated the whole area. They also found disarticulated skeletons, that is, skeletons that were not together. The bones were just scattered down in that destruction layer. And they can tell from their excavation that the city was unoccupied for hundreds of years after the destruction that occurred in the time of Lot. Let's look forward now to Egypt. Is there any evidence that the Israelites were in Egypt? Well, there's been an excavation of the city of Avaris in the Nile Delta, which we call the land of Goshen in the Bible. It's been excavated, and there's lots of evidence found that it was occupied by Semitic peoples. They're dating it to 1783 to 1550 BC, and that would have arguably been the time that Joseph was living and afterwards, up until the Exodus. Those doing the excavation are calling these peoples the Hyksos, which there were Semitic peoples that invaded Egypt at some time, probably later. But these people could easily have been the Israelites. They're Semitic people. They're all similar in characteristics from that part of the world. Now, there's a tomb showing a caravan of Asiatics, could be Hebrews, but entering Egypt. And that's probably what it looked like when Jacob and his family all traveled down to Egypt. This may or may not really be a picture of them, but it's documented that the Semitic peoples, Asiatics, like the Hebrews, went to Egypt in groups. Now, the city of Ramses, or Pi-Ramses, was built on top of Avaris about 200 years later in the time of the Pharaoh Ramses. And one possible interpretation of the biblical reference to the city as Ramses could just be that Jewish scribes, as they were copying the Bible, instead of using the old name of Avaris, which nobody knew any longer, they just substituted the current name of that city, which was Ramses. So there's more evidence of the Israelites being in Egypt. One thing that's rather exciting to me, they have uncovered in their digs a palatial home in Avaris that had 12 pillars, and it was built in the Syrian style or the Semitic style. It had 12 tombs located within the compound, and the largest tomb of the 12 was in the shape of a pyramid. Well, how many children did Jacob have? 12, where the 12 tribes of Israel came from. And the pyramid tomb contained a statue of an Asiatic person, can judge by the hairstyle and the other equipment that this person was carrying in the statue. It would have been an Asiatic person. Semitic, could have been an Israelite. But interestingly, the statue shows a person with a multicolored coat. Now, they didn't find any bones in the tomb, and so personally I believe this is very likely the tomb of Joseph. If you remember the biblical account, Joseph made his descendants promise that when they left Egypt, and he was convinced they would leave Egypt one day, that they should carry his bones with them and bury him in the land of Israel. So that would explain why they found all of this stuff in a tomb, but no bones in it. Well, let's look now 40 years later, after the Exodus, to the fall of Jericho. Jericho, if our date is correct about the Exodus, around 1450, probably 1446 or 7 BC, then the destruction of Jericho 40 years later would be around 1400 BC. Well, they found some pottery in the excavation of Jericho that's unique to this date range that would put it around 1400. Now, they found in the excavation the city was destroyed, but there was lots of grain in the storage jars. That fits with an attack occurring in the spring as recorded in the Bible, right after their harvest. So they would have just harvested their grain. They would have stored up lots of grain so they could handle a long siege. But the grain wasn't eaten up, so the siege didn't last very long because the grain's intact, and the grain wasn't taken by the conquerors, which some have pointed out grain was a really valuable commodity. Why wouldn't the conquerors have taken the grain? Well, the Bible tells us why. That is, God instructed them to take nothing from the city except the gold and silver, which was to be dedicated to the Lord. So when Achan took some garments, he ended up being stoned to death along with his family. So they honored that command by God through Joshua not to take anything out of the city. There's a 3-foot layer of ash indicating that the city was burned, which is exactly what the Bible records. Now, Jericho was a well-fortified city. You can see a picture here on the slide. It had 2 walls, the lower wall and the upper wall. The lower wall stood on top of a retaining wall, and then there was a slope, an embankment between the lower and the upper walls, and this was designed to make it really hard for an army to get into Jericho. They'd have to get up the retaining wall, over the lower city wall, climb the embankment while being shot at from the upper city walls to get inside. Well, the wall fell down. In fact, just think how high this was if you see it on the slide. Retaining wall 12 to 15 feet high, a mud brick wall on top of it 20 to 26 feet high, and then the top wall above it higher still. So the top of the wall, the upper part, was about 46 feet above the surrounding area. An army without siege engines didn't stand much of a chance of getting into that city. So how'd they get in? Well, the archaeological excavation shows that the wall fell down. The mud brick wall, the lower wall, fell down at the base of the retaining wall. If you think about it, that was kind of fortuitous for the Israelites because now the pile of mud bricks gave them something to climb to get up to the top of the wall. Well, one could say, so there was an earthquake. Well, God often uses natural phenomenon, and if there was an earthquake, which may very well be the way God did it, if the earthquake occurred just at the point where the priests of Israel blew their trumpets after they had walked around the city for 7 times, that's quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? To me, it says, God did it. However he did it, he caused the wall to fall down at just the right time when he said he would, and the Israelites were able to get into the city. Now, there's one other thing about this excavation of Jericho. There was one section of wall that didn't fall down. Along that section, there were some houses in the area between the 2 walls, and this is an artist's rendition I'm showing on the slide. Some of the houses backed up to the lower wall. And in that small section of wall that didn't fall, the houses were not destroyed either, which lends credence to the biblical story of Rahab and the fact that she was told to hang the scarlet cord out of her window and that she would be saved. So when God kept the bit of wall in the house where Rahab was from falling down, he was keeping his promise. But if you look at all the evidence so far they've uncovered from Jericho, it's very consistent with the biblical account. You just have to get past the chronology date and believe that this occurred around 1400 BC, which actually fits quite well with other things in the Bible. We know when the temple was built. The temple construction was started 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt. That would put the Exodus at around that 1450 BC time frame. Now, when the Israelites conquered Canaan, they moved all over the land of Canaan, conquered a number of cities. One of the big ones mentioned in their conquest was the city of Hazor, or I believe they really pronounce it Hatzor, was destroyed at the same time, approximately as Jericho. Hatzor was a thriving Canaanite city at the time the Israelites entered the land, and they destroyed it as described in the book of Joshua. In fact, Joshua mentioned the name of the king of the city as Jabin. And so that's what the Bible calls him. They found some inscription, or tablets in their excavation of Hatzor that mentioned the king Jabin. So again, the Bible is shown to be accurate in the name of the ruling monarch. Hatzor was again defeated when they oppressed the Israelites in the time of Deborah the judge, and the Israelites under the command of Barak defeated the Canaanites there a second time, and the name of the king was called Jabin in that account as well. Some think that Jabin was kind of like a title, like Pharaoh was a title for the kings of Egypt. So now we go past the time of the conquest and to the time of the judges. There's something that's been found, I think, fairly recently. I saw reference to it just in the last decade or two when it occurred, but it's a coin. The coin was found in Israel, in the area where Samson would have lived, but it shows a man fighting a lion. It's 3,000 years old. The coin's pretty old, but it's still visible. You can still see the figure of some four-legged animal, which could very well be a lion, and a man standing there doing battle with this lion. It was found near the excavation of the town of Beit Shemesh, or Beth Shemesh as the Bible calls it. It's in the foothills west of Jerusalem, near the Sorek River, which formed the boundary between the Israelites and the Philistines. And this is the area where Samson lived. So this is very likely the coin that was minted in honor of their hero, Samson. I've been trying to put some internet references to where I got some of these pictures and some of the information. There's just a wealth of that out there on the internet. So I put this on here just so you can go look for yourself if you want to. But again, some evidence that seems to be very supportive of the Bible, of the existence of Samson and his story of defeating the lion. Now, sometime, it spans all the way probably from the time of the Exodus way up for hundreds of years, but the Hittite civilization is mentioned in the Bible in a number of places. And the skeptics used to say that there was no evidence of a Hittite civilization, but then in the 1800s, archaeologists discovered their capital city, Hattusa, up in north-central Asia Minor. They found tablets and inscriptions in the language of the Hittites, and they had to translate it, but that's another problem. They did find in Egypt, on the wall of the Great Karnak Temple in Egypt, they found a treaty between Pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittites. So they found that treaty. They found enough documents and inscriptions in multiple languages that they were able to translate the Hittite language. It was really interesting because the people of the area are generally Semitic, the Egyptians are Hamitic, and this is an Indo-European language that turns out they spoke. And that's puzzled them as to how they got the language. Well, let's fast forward to the time of the kings of Israel. They've dug up, again, fairly recently, seals belonging to Isaiah and to King Hezekiah. These seals were found in Jerusalem at the foot of the Temple Mount. They were found within 3 feet of each other. And Isaiah's name is on one seal, but a corner is broken off. They can't read it in its entirety, but it appears to be Isaiah the prophet. And then there's another seal, the one belonging to Hezekiah the king. It says, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Well, Isaiah the prophet was an advisor to King Hezekiah, was in King Hezekiah's presence quite often, and it would make sense if the seals of these two individuals were found close together in the city of Jerusalem. In fact, many believe that Isaiah himself was not a brother, but just a relative somehow of the royal house, and that's how he got such access to the temple and the kingdom. Well, Hezekiah's tunnel was discovered under Jerusalem. The Bible tells us that Hezekiah built a tunnel to bring water from the Gihon spring into the city, and he used that water to fill the pool of Siloam. Now, this was done in preparation for the siege of the Assyrian army. They wanted to make sure that they had access to water. The spring was outside the city, but they dug the tunnel to bring the water inside where they needed it. And there was a Siloam inscription that was found in the tunnel. I've got other pictures that show where they chiseled the inscription out. So archaeologists took that inscription, they moved it to a museum somewhere. They were able to read it, and it describes the process of the final breakthrough, as I think it was 2 different teams were working toward each other, digging the tunnel, and they finally met. So just documenting that final completion of the tunnel. Finally, in another evidence of the reign of Hezekiah and the events mentioned in it, there's the Sennacherib prism. This prism was found in excavating the Assyrian capital. We find Hezekiah mentioned by the Assyrians in the Sennacherib prison. Sennacherib was the king of Assyria who came against Judah, who took all the cities of Judah and surrounded Jerusalem and was eventually going to capture Jerusalem. Turns out God intervened. God destroyed Sennacherib's entire army overnight, and he went home in disgrace. Now, on the Sennacherib prison, the Assyrian king boasts that he has Hezekiah the Judahite shut up in Jerusalem like a caged bird. So he's got the city surrounded, he's prepared to take it, but he doesn't brag about capturing Jerusalem, and the reason is because he didn't. You might ask, why didn't he tell about the death of his army? Well, if you study history at all, especially this time in history, kings always put up monuments and bragged about their successes. They never mentioned their failures. They never mentioned their defeats. So, yeah, Sennacherib did come against Judah, but he didn't take Jerusalem. Now let's move forward to the time of the captivity, when the Israelites were taken into Babylon, and then eventually the Medes and the Persians captured Babylon, and Daniel and his friends were there in Babylon. The book of Daniel tells the story of the different encounters he had with King Nebuchadnezzar and the subsequent kings. Well, it turns out Daniel 5 tells the story of the handwriting on the wall, in which King Belshazzar brought out the golden articles of worship from the temple. He had a drunken party and was drinking out of the goblets and using the articles from the temple. And a hand appeared writing on the wall, pronounced the coming fall of Babylon. And of course, Belshazzar was frightened seeing that. Daniel came in and translated the writing on the wall and told him what it meant. But skeptics have claimed for years that Belshazzar did not exist. He wasn't mentioned in other writings of the Babylonians, but finally the Nabonidus cylinder was discovered. Nabonidus was the ruler of Babylon before the fall of Babylon. In fact, he would have been there and would have been captured and killed if he hadn't been out of the country. But it turns out in the Nabonidus Chronicle, it says that he lived in Arabia for much of his reign. And when he was in Arabia, he left his son Belshazzar in charge of Babylon, and Belshazzar is the one that was there when it fell. So archaeology has confirmed what the Bible tells us. In fact, this explains something that's rather surprising. When you read the story in Daniel, Belshazzar offers Daniel the third place in the kingdom because he interpreted the handwriting on the wall. Well, Daniel turned down the offer because he knew the kingdom didn't have 24 hours to survive. But why he offered the third place was that Nabonidus had the first place as the king of Babylon. His son Belshazzar had the second place, so Belshazzar was simply offering Daniel the next available position in the hierarchy of Babylonian rulers. Well, the Bible was once again proven to be correct on this. So now we go forward and look at some archaeological finds from the time of the New Testament. One is an inscription mentioning Pontius Pilate. It was found in Caesarea by the Sea, or Caesarea Maritima, as the Latins would call it, and that's on the coast of Israel. And he's mentioned on this inscription in conjunction with Caesar Tiberius, who was the reigning Caesar at the time. It refers to Pontius Pilate as a prefect. So this serves as proof that Pilate really existed, and he served. In fact, we know from other history, served from 26 to 36 AD, which was a really long tenure, apparently, for a prefect. And that would have made him the prefect of Judea at the time Jesus was crucified, somewhere around 33 AD. Now, other things from the New Testament times, there was an ossuary found. An ossuary is a bone box. It was found in a burial cave near Jerusalem, and there were 6 ossuaries actually that were found in that area, in that cave. One contained a coin minted by Herod Agrippa, which would have dated it 37 to 44 AD, so not long after Jesus' crucifixion. But definitely the cave and the ossuary can be dated to the 1st century. The inscription on one ossuary says Joseph bar Caiaphas. Now Caiaphas is mentioned as a high priest in the New Testament. It seems from the information they have that Caiaphas was a family name. Joseph was probably his given name, and Bar Caiaphas means son of Caiaphas or descendant of Caiaphas. The ornate ossuary you see on the slide here shows that he was from a wealthy family. And this is possibly the high priest that handed Jesus over to Pilate to be crucified, but certainly someone from his family. In the first century, the bones of the deceased were removed from the tomb after 1 year, after the body had decomposed, and they were placed in this ossuary, a bone box, and kept there. In fact, the ossuary that was found there in Israel, I think in the area of Jerusalem, has an inscription that says, James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, it's very rare for an ossuary to mention a brother. Most family lineages don't mention the brothers, they just mention father and son. So we think that this was, in fact, the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus our Lord. And there was a 7-year forgery trial held by experts, archaeological experts. Most of them were skeptics. And after this extensive trial and examination of the evidence and interviewing many, many witnesses, they came to the conclusion that the inscription was genuine. It was not something that was added later. So we have an ossuary that is probably the one belonging to James, the elder. He became a leading figure in the Jerusalem church. And you can see in the picture the inscription up close, and then the ossuary they found the inscription on. Now, we have some information coming from Macedonia and Greece. The Erastus inscription was found in Corinth. And the inscription was written in Greek, but using abbreviations, and the translation of it is Erastus, for his ideal ship, laid the pavement at his own expense. So an ideal, not sure how they pronounce it in Greek, was a kind of a city manager. And in the Bible, Paul, the apostle, refers to Erastus in Romans chapter 16, verse 23, as a city treasurer in Corinth. The NIV translation reads director of public works. Other translations read the city treasurer. But in any case, there was an Erastus mentioned in the Bible that was an administrative figure in the city of Corinth, and now we found, dating to the 1st century, an inscription there referring to Erastus as a type of city manager. 2 other verses in the Bible mention Erastus as a companion who traveled with Paul some. So most biblical scholars believe this is the same Erastus. I mean, skeptics could always claim, well, maybe there were 2 Erastuses. Same name, but slightly different jobs. But I think it's very unlikely that there were 2 such city officials in Corinth during the same time period. It's probably a reference, an archaeological find that confirms the name of Erastus who's mentioned in the Bible. Now, an inscription has been found in Thessalonica mentioning Politarchs. This inscription I'm showing here, and if you can look at it really close, you can read the Greek and see what it's saying. I can read a little bit of it. But the inscription was located on the Vardar Gate Arch along the Egnatian Way, which is a major highway coming through Greece and Asia Minor. And it mentions on the inscription Politarchuton, which means Politarchs. Luke wrote about the city officials in Acts 17:6 and says, and when they could not find them, meaning Paul and I guess Silas, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, using the term here politarchs, is what Luke wrote, shouting, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. Before this inscription was discovered, skeptics claimed that Luke made up this term. They'd never seen the term politarch anywhere, and they didn't think that there was such an official. However, fast forward a few decades, now they've found 60 known inscriptions mentioning politarchs, half of them being from Thessalonica and the other from the surrounding area there, Macedonia, northern Greece. So once again, the Bible and the writing of Luke has been confirmed as being accurate. Well, that's all of the archaeological finds I wanted to discuss and had time to discuss in this presentation. I think it's some of the most important ones. There are many, many others. There was an archaeologist and a Jewish rabbi named Nelson Gluck. Now, he had done archaeology in the Middle East and in the areas where the Bible occurred, and he made this statement. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of biblical descriptions has often led to amazing discoveries. There have been many archaeologists that took the Bible and followed the stories and places described and actually managed to find and dig up, excavate some places in the Bible. The Bible is unique in that so many of its statements have been corroborated by history and by archaeology. There are other religious texts that claim inspiration, one being the Book of Mormon. However, they can't make that kind of a claim. They claim that there are some things in Central America that are places and peoples that were referenced in the Book of Mormon, but they don't have any strong evidence. They don't have translations of documents or inscriptions there that they can read that refer to people or places in the Book of Mormon. So they're lacking the kind of corroboration that the Bible has had for centuries by archaeology. So, what will you do with this evidence? Sir William Ramsay was an archaeologist and a skeptic when he began investigating Asia Minor and traveling and excavating using Luke's account in Acts as a guide. As he traveled through Asia Minor, he found more and more evidence of Luke's accuracy. And here's a quote from Sir William Ramsay. I began with a mind unfavorable to it, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the Book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. Eventually, Sir William Ramsay converted to Christianity, and I think it's largely because he saw the accuracy in his archaeological work, the accuracy of the things stated in the Bible. So, what will you do with the archaeological evidence presented here? The fact that they can find people, places, events mentioned in the Bible that really occurred, many of them, that doesn't prove the Bible is inspired by God. But if the Bible is inspired by God, you would expect it to be historically accurate, wouldn't you? Well, I think this just adds to the pile of evidence supporting the Bible as the Word of God, as not only truthful and historically accurate, but as His inspired Word. So I encourage you to think deeply about this and consider what this evidence means to you. In our next episode of the Mountainside Apologetics series, you'll be hearing from Evan Van Sickle. So join us for the next lesson, which should be available soon. Thank you for going on this journey with me. The real question that remains is, what will you do with this evidence? The mass of archaeological evidence that confirms many statements made in the Bible about people, places, and events corroborates the Bible's accuracy and historicity. It can't prove that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, but I hope you'll come to that conclusion with me when we see that added to the tremendous mass of other evidences for the Bible as God's Word. I hope you come to that same conclusion and place your faith in Him. God bless you, and we will be back with another episode soon. Bye.